exorcisms are not fun. So I literally climbed over the commune wall. And another really, really, really big thing is called social proof. And so if you're surrounded by a group of people and someone is saying something completely bonkers, but nobody else is responding as though that's completely bonkers, everyone's going along with it. And so the children of God specifically, when they would put out some of their crazy doctrines, like we're all going to have sex with Jesus now, they would literally issue like an edict that this has to be read with other members. Right. And like that was the practice anyway. You sit around, you have your devotions, you read out the doctrines. But if someone was like watching the children or away for some reason, they couldn't catch up on it by themselves. They had to be with another person.
You have to bounce it off of somebody else who kind of sets the narrative of, is this crazy or not?
Right.
And then and then if everybody else is like, no, that's not weird, then you're like, oh, I guess it's not weird, right? Yeah, the social cues aren't there.
And that's exactly. So it's really easy to cross a line. And like that's how extremism works, right? Everybody thinks they would walk away when their guru says, "Hey, sex with children is cool." Right? And like I'm from 10,000 people that did not walk away. But that's how it happens, right? It's like incrementally, and then by the time you get there, there's just no line. You just keep going.
So, like growing up in one, I know you write about this a lot in your book, Uncultured. How do you get out of that as a kid? Because I would just think like, oh, this is just what life is like. Like I would have no perspective to know that maybe this wasn't the way things should be.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think sorry. Um this is where I think that for me part of it was just being neurodiverse or being the different kid. The way I always saw it as just I was I was the one always asking why. Like I don't know if I was ever religious ever. I kind of think I just don't have a religious bone in my body. I'm just a very logical, neurodivergent, likes to know why, loves to know processes, loves to ask questions. And that's not allowed. That was the wrong thing to be in the cult. And so from a very young age, I remember being 6 years old and being like, oh, I'm not doing this. I'm going to grow up and be something else. So that was part of it for me. Part of it was that my mother was also born and raised in the cult. So I had a bit of a different experience than others. Like I had less connection to the outside world, but also she kind of radicalized me a little bit without realizing it. We're 15 years apart in age, and there was one point when I was 11 and I was probably her biggest confidant as she was having doubts. And she couldn't speak them to anyone else, but she could speak them to me. And then finally, part of it was just, I just think really, really bad treatment. And for teenagers, like at some point, because it's not like we never had interaction with the world, especially because like the Children of God was the performance cult. Like every cult has a thing that they use to make money, and we performed, and we produced River and Joaquin Phoenix and Rose McGowan, and we claimed Jeremy Spencer of Fleetwood Mac, who was a horrible, abusive person, and we produced all this stuff. And so we were out in the world performing and interacting with a world that we were told was evil, but that I experienced as the people outside seemed nicer. And that's just, I guess for me, it was just the process of like, it was just so miserable that by the time I was 15 years old, I was like, no, I need to get them to kick me out or throw me out or figure my way out of here. Otherwise, I'm just not going to survive.
how hard is it to get out?
Um, so like in my case, like I was like, look, if they, especially when you're young, if they think there's a chance they can save you, they're gonna try, and exorcisms are not fun. So I'm going to do the worst thing, which at the time there was no contact with outsiders. So I literally climbed over the commune wall and snuck away to go meet my boyfriend. Um, and then I got caught. So then that was like you will now be thrown out. That was the big sin. Um, they sort of realized they then maybe didn't want to throw out a high profile third generation child whose parents and grandparents were all like intricately tied into the leadership. So then they tried to like bring in the cool young aunties my mom's age who'd grown up in the cult and stayed and tried to convince me that it was still great. And I think at one point my mom thought that maybe I was falling for it. And so she took me on a walk outside the commune and she was like, you need to go. You need to go. We have one of my stepsisters, because my mom at the age of 20 was partnered with a 40-year-old guy who had 7 children already. And so one of my stepsisters, who I did not know at all, had agreed to, take the 15-year-old. And my mom was sort of like, look, I know it's scary, but like, go. And I asked her years later why she did that. And she just said, like, she could tell that I was not happy and hadn't been happy for a very long time. And so I sort of had this push. The logistics after that was just we bought 3 bus tickets from Guadalajara, Mexico to Houston, Texas, and my parents brought me and dropped me off at $0 with a woman I didn't know very well and went back to their commune. And then I put myself through high school and college.
Yeah, can people, when they leave, can they kind of live a normal life? Or is it kind of the idea of somebody maybe beats an addiction, but then they beat alcohol addiction, but then they become addicted to exercise? Like, do they
Yes.
get out, or do they just trade this for something else?
Right. So you can't get out of a cult and just lead a normal life without dealing with your trauma. I firmly believe that. And there are quite a few psychologists and sociologists that say, like, they don't think it's possible to heal from cult trauma without understanding what happened to you. Now, most of us don't want to hear that. Um, and I've identified these like 3 phases of leaving a cult, right? So the first is the crack and the brainwashing and the physically and mentally leaving. And then there's the next phase is a decade of deconstruction where you're understanding why you were in a cult, even if you were born in one, and what impacts it had on your personality and identity. But that decade doesn't start till you start it. So for many of us, especially those of us that have to go straight into survival mode as soon as we leave a cult, like we just don't deal with it. So I just from the age of 15 to 25 was like, nope, not going to deal with it. Um, Sometimes people do that hard until they're about 40s or 50s, like from my background, and then they break. I went into the military and just exactly paralleled and doubled down on all the trauma. So I was breaking by about 25. And that was the point that I really had to start kind of deconstructing and doing the work to understand my experience. Um, and one of the big things for me was kind of answering that question of realizing that like I had subconsciously believed that I could outrun it, right? That I could out perfection it. Perfectionism was absolutely my post cult heroin addiction, right? Like college, valedictorian, military, I can run 5-minute miles and I will do it, even if my body is not prepared and I'm going to be broken because, like, I will be the best because that was what I was trained in a cult. Um, so I think at some point, like, and for me, it was when I was an army captain, like, I did it. I beat the odds. I am the hero story. And, like, I'm completely broken. You know, I was so suicidal for a decade. And I always used to think, like, everyone's going to say, where did that come from? Right? It came out of nowhere. Like, she's bubbly, she's perfect, she's all the things. And when I was a captain in the army and I was like, oh, I'm not magically healed. Okay. Like, now I'm going to have to deal. And so I do think that, like, there's no, you know, you have to spend a decade understanding what impacts it had on your personality and identity because it had that many impacts.